The problem in Yemen is that the United Nations have set a dangerous precedent. Essentially, they've implied to the parties that they are ready to acknowledge the strongest, they are ready to acknowledge the winner, they are ready to acknowledge the one who can militarily establish themselves in as much territory as possible. How did they do this? Following the fall of Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president who fell as a result of Arab Spring-style protests, all of the parties across the spectrum, including the Houthis, came together and agreed that there would be a transitional government run by Abdurrabbah Mansour Hadi, the current president of the internationally recognized government. And following the transition period, there would be elections and Yemen would begin its course of democracy. The Houthis, having signed the agreement and agreed to this transitional government, returned to Sa'da and then changed their minds. They rode a wave of discontent at the rise of living. On the pretext of fighting terrorism, they took Jawf and Amran in the north. Then they allied with the former president Ali Abdullah Saleh, who fell as a result of the Arab Spring-style protests. They blockaded Sana'a for 2 weeks. When they saw a lack of response from the international community, they stormed the capital city, put the government under house arrest, including the president. Here, it follows that because there was a national dialogue, the stance of the international community should be to restore the national dialogue agreement. In other words, to restore the transitional government. Why? Because all of the political parties, including the Houthis, agreed to it. And only the Houthis reneged on it. Instead, the UN envoy Jamal bin Umar implied to the Houthis that if they could clear up the mess, if they could come up with a government, if they could establish what they were calling at that time a military council, then the UN would be ready to acknowledge it. John Kerry, the Secretary of State of the US at the time, suggested that Houthi could be a vital partner in fighting against terrorism. In other words, in the midst of international apathy towards what took place in Sana'a, which can only be described as a coup, the Houthis became emboldened. When the Saudis intervened and enabled Hadi to do a great escape in which he fled to Aden in the south, the Houthis continued marching southwards, taking advantage of the divisions amongst their opponents. They got to the gates of Aden, and then the Saudis intervened with decisive storm and pushed the Houthis all the way back to Sana'a. However, the international community's insistence on acknowledging Houthis' military gains, their insistence on calling for new dialogue, for new negotiations, instead of restoring the original national dialogue, essentially sent a message to the Southern Separatists, to Islah, to Houthis, and to all the other armed groups in Yemen, which is, if you seize enough cities, if you establish yourself militarily in these cities, and you survive the backlash long enough, we will call for new talks and new negotiations that will bring about a government that recognizes these military gains, or at least gives you a significant influence over that government. Why? Because we do not want to commit the resources in order to re-establish that the transitional government that came about as a result of that national dialogue. In other words, the Southern Separatists now, who have been backed and armed by the UAE, know that if they can carve out an independent state in the south, the international community will recognize them. Because the overriding principles are not democracy, they are not human rights, they are not the desire of Yemeni people to seek a life of dignity and to establish a nation in which all people live freely. The international community simply says, look, who is the strongest? Okay, we want stability, we don't want the spread of terrorism, we don't want any security threats, let's recognize whoever is the strongest. And this is why the UN has been the single most important provided the single most important encouragement to the Houthis to reject all agreements, to reject all negotiations, to reject all dialogue, because the Houthis know that if they stay in Sana'a long enough, if they stay in Hudaydah long enough, eventually their military gains will be recognized. And the Southern Separatists, who are one of the strongest fighting forces in the south, have no interest in going north. Now they are trying to do a coup on the internationally recognized government in Aden, essentially to force the international community to recognize the reality of North Yemen and South Yemen. And all of this came about as a result of the failure of the international community to respect a democratic agreement made between all of the Yemeni parties that the transitional government should operate, and then there should be elections. Houthis did not want elections because they knew that if they go to elections, they would be a minority party. But if they can force themselves on Yemen by force, by weapons, by logistic supplies from Iran, then the international community, as they recognize Sisi in Egypt, who overthrew a democratically elected president, will recognize their power in Yemen, and any government that comes about, even if it's a government that rules over all of Yemen, the Houthis will be a Hezbollah-esque entity whereby there will be an armed group that will be able to force itself on the government if it feels the government doesn't go its way. And this is the tragedy of Yemen. The tragedy of Yemen is not the humanitarian crisis, even though that is a tragedy. The tragedy of Yemen is that all of the Yemeni parties that are armed realized that the international community is not interested in democratic principles. They are only interested in stability and power. And that is the two things that those are the two things that they recognize. If the Houthis can offer stability and power, then tomorrow the international community appear ready to give them the largest say in a government. And this is the reason why all of negotiations until now have failed miserably. Until there is respect for the National Dialogue Agreement, a democratic institution that came about from all of the Yemeni parties, that all the Yemeni parties took place, then all the parties know that it is the rule law of the jungle. Whoever is the strongest wins, and the international community will recognize them in the end.